From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. This is Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, and of course the reason we're all here, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. David, tell the good people, our listeners, about Ralph's guest today.
Our guest today is Mark Green. Mark has been a public interest lawyer, an elected public official, author, and the president of Air America Radio. Mark Green spent 10 years in the 1970s working with Ralph Nader, ultimately running Public Citizens Congress Watch, the largest consumer lobbying group in D.C. In 1982, The Nation magazine said, next to Nader himself, Mark is the leading public interest lawyer of his generation. In 1981, Mark Green founded and ran the Democracy Project, a public policy institute in New York City. He's also served as New York City Consumer Affairs Commissioner and has been elected public advocate for New York City. Mr. Green also hosts his own radio show called Both Sides Now, where conservatives and liberals debate current events. We're happy to have him join us today. Welcome, Mark Green.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for being on the program. I want to run through a lot of important things with you today. But first, Bill Grider just wrote an article for The Nation. He's a very well-regarded progressive analyst of politics in America. And he basically asks himself and the readers, is Hillary ready for us? And he starts off by saying that the Hillary campaign, such as it is, Ready for Hillary, is trying to woo discontented Democrats, strong progressives who have great skepticism about Hillary's ties to both Wall Street and the military-industrial complex. And in the article, he sort of takes us back to Bill Clinton and says, is this a situation of here we go again, promises broken? And I want to read you just a paragraph here. As you remember, in 1992, when Clinton ran for president, his slogan was putting people first. And Grider continues saying, Clinton explained he would devote major federal spending to rebuilding the nation's infrastructure and broadening social guarantees. He promised to protect working people and organized labor who correctly saw their jobs and wages threatened by the new trade agreement called NAFTA. He would go after big business subsidies and scandalous tax loopholes. Attacking the bloated compensation for corporate executives was the core example of what Clinton intended. What's not to like? That's Bill Grider. And then he continues simply by saying that President Clinton reversed course or abandoned the meat of his promises. He passed NAFTA with Republican votes over labor's opposition and cut a deal with Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan to let the Fed command a slow growth economy. End quote. So the question I ask of you is this going to be another promise betrayal as Hillary starts wooing the progressive left?
First of all, I am the Mark Green, as I was introduced, that worked with Ralph and was deeply imprinted with him for 10 years. I've read a lot of Bill Grider's books, and I think he came up with the phrase Nader's Raiders, as Ralph and I know. And you're both right that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are center-left Democratic, keyword, politicians. And so I know them well personally. And when Bill Clinton ran, he said he would have a middle-class tax cut. Never did it because he thought the economics couldn't handle it. And when Barack Obama ran, he said he was evolving on gay marriage. That was a lie. He believed in gay marriage. But like Lincoln thought 1862 was too early for the emancipation, which was a moral necessity, he figured 1863 was about right because he had won some battles. My point is they're politicians. And this is not self-promotion because it's not going to be out for a year and a half. I'm writing a memoir. And the reason is because I've been an advocate in Ralph's arena, and I've been a politician seeking money and votes. And there are common skills, but they're different. And so Hillary Clinton is a wonderful woman privately, extremely smart and conscientious, works like Nader a la 1970. But she has to raise $1 billion. And so will she agree with Ralph Nader and Elizabeth Warren on some of these populist economic issues you raised? I believe she will tilt that way. Yeah, she was on the Walmart board of directors. Yeah, she gets speaking fees from places like Goldman Sachs. But she is trying to make sure that the country doesn't go back to the third Bush rather than the second Clinton. And the difference between Ralph and me, if I may say on this, is Ralph's run for office, but no one was panicked that he would get elected president. Some people were panicked at the quality of his voice and ideas. But I had to run to get 50% plus one. And you don't want to lie as a candidate. I don't think Hillary ever wakes up and says, I'm going to promise X, but I'm not going to do it. I don't believe she ever does that. But situationally, will she end up in a situation like Bill Clinton, where he couldn't produce a middle-class tax cut? Although he did, of course, increase the income tax rates from Bush 41 to the 39% that W then lowered. They will be as populist as an activist populist left demands, because I think their heart is in the right place. But their goal is not to be the most populist candidate ever. Their goal is to get one more electoral vote than a party that believes in what Ted Cruz believes in. And that's pretty serious.
Do you think, Mark, that they're misreading the public here? There's a lot of anger out there among workers. In fact, there's a left-right coalition building for raising the minimum wage. Walmart workers, for example. But don't you think they're misreading the public, that basically they're becoming politicians because they got to raise a lot of money, and they're not becoming politicians because they can break through and bring a lot of blue-collar workers and others to vote for their candidacy? Here's the dilemma of the progressive left. The Clintons and others basically say to them, we're still going to stay close with Larry Summers. He's going to be an advisor. We're still going to stay close with Robert Rubin. He's a big fundraiser, former Secretary of Treasury under Bill Clinton, even though we know what they represent, because progressives have nowhere to go. Where are they going to go? So this gets to the core of what you're distinguishing between being an advocate and a politician. At what point do you cut away from the least worst choice between Republicans and Democrats? Because every 4 years it become more and more corporate. I think that's a matter of record, both Republicans and Democrats. What do you advise voters who basically are saying, if we go least worst, we're pushing both parties to the right, and they're going to turn their back on us because we have lost our bargaining power?
Well, you're right, hence your candidacy as a third-party candidate. We've had least worst for a lot of elections, and it's not hard if you're objecting, hypothetically, to Senator Barack Obama on gay marriage to say, whoa, John McCain is going to invade every country after W. And so he won partly because of his inspiration, but partly because he wasn't the other team. And often in the scandals, so-called, from non-scandals like Whitewater to real scandals like Lewinsky to incipient but probably non-scandals like the emails, the Clintons have been blessed by crazy opponents who make them look good. Newt Gingrich, for example. John McCain even last week said Hillary Clinton committed a crime. You shouldn't use phrases like that about a senator or secretary of state unless, it's evidence of intent. And so put that aside. Ralph, you're right. And they will be as progressive as they think the country can take. Bill Clinton comes out of Arkansas. He's not out of the progressive tradition. Hillary Clinton is a kind of small-town Illinois woman who's Midwestern. But there's something in her, Ralph. Ralph and I have disagreed about Hillary Clinton. Here she is graduating Wellesley. She stands up, a no-name speaker at a commencement, and rips to shreds Senator Edward Brooke on some issue involving either civil rights or the war, Vietnam War. So there is something in her that is really admirable. However, she did not stick her neck out on Iraq. It's a terrible vote that cost her the presidency. And they're very cautious.
Can I ask a question to both
Please.
of you? She did stick her neck out on Hillary Care. So I want to ask both Ralph and Mark about Hillary being the left wing's version of George W. Bush. George W. Bush, I think we can all agree, was a very successful president in the eyes of the people who put him there. He did a lot for the ultra-right wing. My question for Ralph is, did you know he was a Trojan horse in 2000, that he was far more right-wing than he presented himself? And he was successful because he wasn't going to repeat the mistakes that his father made. Could it be argued that Hillary is a Trojan horse for the left who isn't going to repeat the mistakes that Bill made and will be very successful pushing forward a progressive agenda, which she tried to do with Hillary Care?
I wish I could believe that. Because here's why I have skeptical response to your comment, David. We tried for 2 years to get Hillary to come out for a higher minimum wage proposed by the Democrats in Congress, $10 an hour, $10.10 an hour, over 3 years, which would still be substantially less than what the minimum wage was in 1968, adjusted for inflation. And she dawdled and dawdled. We finally sent her 2 letters signed by maybe 15, 20 groups that would be her supporters: women's rights, children's rights, labor rights. And she still resisted. And she finally, in May of last year, came out for Senator Harkin and Congressman George Miller's bill to raise the minimum wage over 3 years to $2.10 an hour. So the press commented at the time that she was torn between her desire to raise the minimum wage but not break her ties to the Wall Street crowd. What an absurdity. This was FDR's flagship reform in the 1930s. This should be a slam dunk. And she still hesitated. So I wonder, Mark, what do you think Elizabeth Warren's role here or potential here to rally the progressives, all along saying she doesn't want to run, but pushing Hillary to the point where Hillary says, I'm going to lose some primaries or elections if I don't really adopt the kind of programs of Main Street against Wall Street that Elizabeth Warren has
3
been
points.
arguing for.
You couldn't be more right, substantively and politically, on the minimum wage. We would talk about it. You were just so privately and publicly indignant for the reasons that you've argued about why it didn't keep up with inflation, and you couldn't live on the minimum wage. And so I don't know why she didn't do that. I don't know. I'm not here as an advocate for her. But the Wall Street money, we grew up, Wall Street is so big in New York City, where I governed, and nationally. However, it's shrinking as a percentage of employment and even shrinking as a percentage of value added to the economy. And in an era of social media and internet fundraising, other than the Koch crowd and the few Democratic billionaires who might want to fund super PACs, any candidate in 2016 will raise, if they're a Bush or Clinton level, $300 million by not making one phone call. It'll be go viral with a great slogan and message, like, in a sense, Howard Dean did by standing up against the Iraq invasion. So it's not simply that she wakes up in the morning thinking, oh, my money crowd, because a third of the money that's going to come in will come in on message, not just sucking up to a big corporation. Your point about Elizabeth Warren is so important. I am stunned by Elizabeth Warren. I'm studying how advocates often don't become politicians and politicians don't become advocates. And Ralph, in a sense, was more an advocate than a politician, but ran for president several times. Well, Robert Reich, who people now know is a almost Paul Krugman level, a populist economist, was a former Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, ran seriously for governor of Massachusetts, lost to a party regular in the primary. Elizabeth Warren is one of the very few people I've ever read about who, while she wasn't in a PERG or a movement person, I read her book, she was just a brilliant law professor, struggling to make ends meet, braining her way up to teach at Harvard Law School, pioneering in the area of bankruptcy law and how people, when they lost their health insurance, went into bankruptcy, and made a name for herself before she ever did anything at Treasury and watching the bailouts and then getting elected senator. Her role is unique. Let's say, unlike Ralph, she's in, technically, the leadership. She has a strong populist view, great at both language and content. So she's not superficial, but she's not just a professor. And she's a woman. And when she speaks on some of these issues, Ralph, Hillary Clinton and her people are going to say, oy vey. We've got to make sure that we don't lose what was the Howard Dean, what is the Liz Warren, the Ralph Nader wing of the party and the independent vote. But politically, they think about Ohio and Florida, probably almost as much or more than money. And then as should she be president, that's where we need our Eleanor Roosevelt, someone of great moral stature and credibility, who can speak to them, be listened to by the Clintons, and push them on policy. One last point. Despite these horrible off-year elections where Democrats and progressives do so poorly because of the structure of government and gerrymandering and money and off-year elections and voting suppression, from the 60s to now, there has been a steady growth, a progressive ascent in public opinion on gay rights and marijuana rights. And women's rights and consumer justice and civil rights. Selma is now, we also what happened this week. And the press don't write about this, but in popularity, if you don't believe climate change exists, if you're against the minimum wage, these are 80-20 winners for Democrats.
That's right. In fact, breaking up the big New York banks that are too big to fail, it comes in at 90%. That's a lot of left-right support.
I had a question because you cannot gerrymander a presidential election. And I wanted to ask Ralph, how far to the left can the Democrats go in the general election without losing the presidency? How far left could you go?
I think you can go very far in the interests of the people, regardless of whether they call themselves liberals or conservatives. I think Mark makes the point. There's growing support for what we often parochially call progressive agendas, but they're people agendas. I mean, right-wing families, they got to breathe clean air, drink clean water, eat safe food. They like good public transit. They like their bridges and schools repaired. They don't like their tax dollars wasted in huge amounts in the military budget. They don't like the restrictions in the Patriot Act invading their privacy, where the feds can search your home and not let you know for 72 hours and look in your library records. We've got to get off this polarization obsession that the divide and rule plutocrats plunge us in. And the Democrats have got to learn that they can win huge votes by transcending these self-imposed categories and going to where people live, work, and raise their families. I think that's a point that Mark was alluding to. And you can forget about gerrymandering when you transcend those kinds of restrictions which allow the politicians to pick their own voters. That's what gerrymandering does. Can you imagine? The politicians pick their own voters instead of the reverse. Mark, you've written 20 books, from a book on corporate lawyers in Washington called The Other Government to being the prime author of the most popular book in American history, Who Runs Congress? And because you went from an advocate into politics, you're a living example of what I call the antithesis to this idea that politics is a dirty word. Because when politics is a dirty word in a society, the society gets dirty politics almost automatically. But the book that perhaps got least notice, which I thought was really a great book, came out in 2006 by you, calling Losing Our Democracy. And true, it focused on Bush, the far right, and big business betraying Americans for power and profit. But the Democrats have played along with a lot of these things too. They dial for the same commercial dollars. They participate in the wealth primaries. They gerrymander. They don't challenge the military-industrial complex. They say things about tax reform, but they don't really mean it when it comes to corporate tax escapees. Let me put something very concise in front of you. Give us 5 or 6 conditions that have been operating in the last 40 years to deteriorate, degrade, and decay our democracy, our democratic processes, and push people out of the arena where they should have a voice and a strong participatory role.
The first are the silent casualties who never run because they either don't know people of wealth, they don't have a Rolodex of people of wealth, and they're not willing to make, this is not a typo, 30,000 phone calls, as I had to make and did make, running for mayor of New York City. I raised the most money in American history of anyone running for mayor ever. Now, I happened to run against a guy who gave himself $74 million, and that was a problem because of a Supreme Court decision. His name is Michael Bloomberg, of course. And so money can still beat merit, not every time, but the John Corzine, who won election spending $60 million for the Senate in New Jersey, and then Mike Bloomberg for mayor, they're both substantial people. They wouldn't have won without the money. That traces back to 2 Supreme Court decisions that will be reversed in our lifetimes if a Democrat appoints the next 2 Supreme Court justices, overruling the Buckley-Vallejo case of 1976, which started the trend that money is speech. It's not. It's property. And then led to Citizens United, where it was Katie bar the door with money. And a campaign finance reform now, Democrats, frankly, are for it, and Republicans won't allow it. Mitch McConnell's a leading advocate against it because he knows where the money comes from. Second, the voting participation rate of people who earn $150,000 a year is half the rate of the people who vote earning over $100,000. If everybody were required to vote, we don't have enough time to discuss the Australian model at this point, Democrats would do far better. So Republicans know They have to suppress low-income, minority, elderly voters to win. They can't win because of their arguments. I really mean that. They're going to win on climate change when water is sloshing up on the streets of Miami because of extreme weather. They have to make sure the other guys don't vote. And what is a moral crime, and should be almost a political crime, is to come up with, J.P. Morgan once said, there's the stated reason and then the real reason. So they say there's voter fraud, no evidence of it. The real reason is to keep blacks and transients and elderly from voting. And they've been successful in some states. This, too, will get back to the Supreme Court and Congress for the Voting Rights Act. Third is gerrymandering, which both parties do every 10 years. But like anything, both parties filibuster, except one party does it to reprehensible lengths. So there were 2 filibusters a year when Johnson was president, 100 a year when Harry Reid is majority leader because of the Republicans. So a rule of the Senate, 60 votes, it's not a constitutional requirement, changes majority rules. So I'm combining gerrymandering where Congressman then, Tom DeLay, gerrymandered mid-census and 5 seats switched from D to R because of that.
In Texas.
In Texas. Fortunately, in a little notice decision of the Supreme Court last week, state referenda, which changed rules about voting and gerrymandering, were ruled unconstitutional because the people were voting, not the legislature voting. And this is a problem that, again, has to be reversed with the new justice. One of the greatest people I ever worked with, Ralph, was Beverly C. Moore Jr., a man from North Carolina, brilliant. And his life was dedicated to civil justice and greater access to courts. And the class action movement has been stalled and reversed. It's much harder now to have standing to sue as a Welford v. Hardin or Green v. Klutznick in the 70s, where we were Nader Raiders, and we had standing to sue in one case that today couldn't be brought. And if you're going to cheat people in mass, we should allow people to sue in mass. But that is an access to courts problem that also frustrates our conclusion. Democrats now need 57% of the vote to win back the House. Because of gerrymandering in the Senate, you can't gerrymander a Senate seat. Well, because of the gosh darn Connecticut Compromise of 1789, rural states get as many Senate seats as populous states. California has 70 times the population of Wyoming. Both get 2 Senate seats. That's not going to change.
We're talking with Mark Green, author of 20 books. He's my colleague for 10 years in Washington, the founder of the Democracy Project, and the spectacular former New York City public advocate. And you should see what he did in that role for consumer protection and government accountability. And he's now the host of the radio show Both Sides Now. Mark, to what extent would you add to your list as a force that has degraded and weakened our democracy, globalization and NAFTA and World Trade Organization and the coming Trans-Pacific?
Most of what I know about this I've learned from Lori Wallach and Ralph Nader. And when you have a race to the bottom, we saw what happened in corporate law, that the worst state, Delaware, gave more power and prerogatives to the biggest corporations. So they all went there to be chartered, which created their enabling powers. In international trade, if you don't insist on certain labor and human rights standards, then it's a race to the lowest common denominator, which is pesos per hour rather than a livable wage per hour. Unfortunately, my brain is having a problem that if Obama should get his Pacific Trade Treaty through, as Clinton got his NAFTA through, the long-term half-century answer is a UN for trade and human rights. That is, there are common minimum standards. We understand minimum wage, but let's say it used to be Mexico, then it was China, then it was Bangladesh. There'll always be a next Bangladesh paying less. And what's interesting is center-left Democrats like Clinton and Obama, when they come to trade deals, they should be insisting on an inequality impact statement for any bill. Does it worsen or fix inequality? But instead, they think more like international diplomats working with other nations' states trying to lower barriers.
Mark, one time you memorably said, politics is when you have to say nice things about people you don't like. Now,
I said that?
Yeah.
What a brilliant, I'm even smarter than I remember. God.
So my question is, what if you have to advocate things you don't believe in? For example, I know you when you had a fair approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you were basically in favor of a two-state solution.
Sure.
But in New York City, it's like political suicide to divert from whatever the Likud-dominated right-wing militaristic government of Israel is espousing, no matter how many Palestinians are slaughtered or put into open-air jails. And it is political suicide to divert. How did you handle that?
Well, there are some issues that are fundamental by birth, heritage, religion. I'm not defending it, but that you just grow up with a certain way. So this is true for people who hunt in rural areas. And if you talk to them about the Second Amendment, they are not open to the arguments that it was only a militia had a right to a gun. I happen to be Jewish, visited Israel a lot, supported the founding of the state of Israel. But there are levels, Ralph. If I were a senator, I would not have attended Netanyahu's speech, because it was an outrage at many levels. Just as he gave a State of the Union, except for ending, he didn't end with, and God bless the United States. And he is interfering with our negotiations to try to quell nuclearization of the Middle East by negotiation rather than by invasion. And so I was never just salute Netanyahu or his equivalent at the time. But your point is well taken. Barney Frank said, I'm for gun control. Do I lead every speech with it? I do not. And there are certain issues that a candidate, I mentioned earlier, Barack Obama and gay marriage. He was for gay marriage as a state senator. He decided not to give up the chance to be president on that issue. That's morally questionable, but politically rational. So yes, there are times that you swallow what you want, because if you don't win, there's no advocacy in office. That leads to people whoring around for money, and they end up like cookie-cutter politicians. That's true. But, Ralph, did you ever trim your sails when you ran for president? Did you ever say to yourself, oh, boy, I'm in this state. I think I could get 4% of the vote, but I'm going to get 1% if I say X?
Actually, no.
I assume not.
I even went to Iowa and attacked the ethanol subsidy.
Well, that was it. Have you ever been asked this question before?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
And I just decided, right from the beginning, what's the point?
Yeah, but you see, you weren't running to win.
Yeah.
You didn't, yeah.
Oh,
were you ever asked, are you running to win? What did you say?
I'd say, what did I say?
You see, because
I've never asked that.
Because
I've never asked that.
See, if you said yes, that wouldn't have been true.
Right.
But you don't want to admit, I'm not going to win, but vote for me, because then you're wasting your vote.
No, I don't think I ever said I'm running to win. Because, as a third-party candidate in America today.
Well, say it happened before once.
Yeah.
In 1860. 1856, actually.
Only when the Whigs disbanded, though. It became,
the alternative party. Yeah.
Last question to the American people. People are supposed to be sovereign. The preamble to the Constitution starts, we the people. The sovereignty of the people goes right back to the Declaration of Independence. But people are withdrawing. They're giving up. They're making excuses for themselves. They're not voting. They're not showing up in rallies and demonstrations and city council meetings. What would you tell the American people to do?
Well, other than buy Unstoppable, how there are issues that cut across left and right, cliched stereotypes. Because in minimum wage, it's not left-right, it's up-down. And there used to be 70% turnouts a century ago. It was 60% in 1960. And then it fell presidentially to under 50%, congressionally 35%. I ran the last time for Public Advocate. There was a 12% turnout in the primary that de facto picked the nominee. So you get the government you deserve. Now, the biggest change in my lifetime, other than almost women's rights, is the internet, for good or ill. And it's good that people now can get a hashtag and suddenly 1 million people are demanding X. But I worry, as do you, that's often instead of voting and marching, because at the end, people who run for president in Iowa know this. At the end, it's not only your viral message, especially not. It's door-to-door Iowans saying why they like Martin O'Malley or Bernie Sanders or, she has a head start, Hillary Clinton. So from Lincoln to now, the one thing that hasn't changed is person-to-person interaction is the biggest proselytizer of all. And so if people are going to be bowling alone, to quote the Robert Putnam book, that we've become isolated and insulated, which is increasingly true with the web and the internet, we have to figure out how to use this system to get people more activated. So when a member of Congress votes, he or she knows who's watching, because the professional lobbyists, of course, watch.
You make a key point here. The most successful lobbyists in America deal with in personam lobbying directly on the senator, the representative, or the candidate.
The greatest lobby group, there are two greatest lobby groups. One exists: physicians who deliver babies who become the congressman. So when they call Congressman Jones, and it's the physician who delivered him, good access. Yeah. The second greatest lobby group, and I'd like to end with this, doesn't exist. Ralph, how many people would be dead but are alive today because of auto safety? I think we're dealing with, of course, hundreds of thousands, because the death rate per mile driven from 65 when you rode unsafe to 2015, 50 years later, has to be halved or more.
Less than a fourth.
And so if it's 30,000 lives a year on average times 50 years, you can see you're dealing with millions. If they knew who they were, people who wake up today not liking you, or government overreach, and they knew they were alive because of their airbag, their seatbelt, whatever, it's a hell of a lobby group, isn't it?
Tell the audience how they can reach you, give your contact information, how they can listen to your radio program, Both Sides.
Well, Both Sides now has left and right, but I provoke them to say, don't give me your talking points. We got to go beyond. I don't want to hear the word government overreach. That's just a noun. Anybody could come up with it. Martin O'Malley, who's running for president, said to the firefighters this week, when you run into a building to save people, they don't say, sorry, the government is not the answer. Now, our little radio show is, you can go to bothsidesradio.com, and it gives you the gist of the show and the stations it's on. And we try to get to a different level of analysis than you sometimes hear on the Sunday talk shows, but not the Nader hour where you do penetrate to deeper levels.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you
for coming out. Looking forward to your new book out in 2016.
We've been talking to former Nader's Raider and New York City public advocate and host of his own radio show, Both Sides Now, Mark Green. Thank you for joining us, Mark. This is the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Ralph, last week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed Congress, where he talked about the current nuclear negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. In his speech, he said,
"This deal won't be a farewell to arms. It would be a farewell to arms control. And the Middle East would soon be crisscrossed by nuclear tripwires. A region where small skirmishes can trigger big wars would turn into a nuclear tinderbox."
And this week, 47 Republican senators, led by freshman Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, apparently circumventing all official diplomatic protocol, sent a letter to the Iranian leadership in an attempt to undercut the negotiations going on between the White House and Tehran. This was so outrageous that even the conservative New York Daily News printed a cover with the pictures of Cotton, Mitch McConnell, Ted Cruz, and Rand Paul under the headline, Traitors. What do you think of all this going on, Ralph?
Well, the first impression is we've got a warmongering Congress, a majority. They just want more wars that their children will never have to fight in. Other poor whites, blacks, Latinos will have to go over, get into the quagmire, kill and die overseas. So this is what really is troubling about Senator McConnell and Congressman John Boehner. And Boehner's invitation to Prime Minister Netanyahu was not just a violation of protocol and an insult to the conduct of foreign relations by President Obama. It was basically an attempt to hustle the war parties, the military-industrial complex, in pushing more and more toward a militaristic approach toward Iran. And who was the spokesman? It was the Prime Minister of Israel that refuses to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that developed its own nuclear weapons in secrecy back in the 60s and 70s. In fact, according to Cy Hirsch's book, purloined is not just some of the knowledge, but maybe some of the enriched uranium from the U.S. and has about 200 ready-to-fire nuclear weapons now. And Netanyahu is talking about Iran, a country that hasn't invaded anybody in 250 years, a country the size of Massachusetts in terms of its GDP economy, with very impoverished people, 77 million Iranians, surrounded by the U.S. military on the east in Afghanistan, on the west in Iraq, and southern part, the whole Persian Gulf and the mighty U.S. Navy. So I was astonished by this. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in Congress. Consider this. He gave a 42-minute speech before the joint session of Congress, his third time, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He was given 23 standing ovations that took up 10 minutes. 23 standing ovations. I don't know if a president of the United States gets that. And the tragedy is it was a totally one-sided propaganda demonstration. And so I wrote a column a few days ago entitled Netanyahu, the Other Israelis, and Bobby Burns. And it was clear that the other Israeli opinion, which represents major retired heads of the intelligence agencies, the Israeli FBI, the Israeli military, leading politicians, disagree with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Likud coalition. They have stood up at press conferences in Israel. They have stood up in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, but they are blocked for 60 years, by the way, from having a congressional hearing. So that's why I titled it Netanyahu and the Other Israelis. Why did I say Bobby Burns? Because, as we all know from high school, the great Scottish poet, who often is called Robert Burns or Robbie Burns, taught us the crucial empathy in one line. And here is his one line, quote, "Oh, would some power the giftie give us to see ourselves as others see us," end quote. And so if you were the Iranians responding to Netanyahu, you would not only point out that Israel has 200 weapons and refuses inspection because it doesn't belong to the treaty, which Iran does, and that's why it's had international inspections, but it's not as if Israel hasn't threatened Iran with annihilation, sent spies to sabotage and slay Iranian scientists, and worked with its Arab allies to undermine the Iranian regime. The Iranians would say, it's as if the Iranians, we the Iranians, don't remember that the United States overthrew our popular elected Prime Minister, Mossadegh, in 1953 in order to reinstate the Anglo-American Oil Company and the Shah's dictatorship for 26 more years. You know, it's if the Iranians don't mourn the loss of hundreds of thousands of their soldiers and civilians killed by Saddam Hussein's brutal invasion of their country from 1980 to 1988, with the military intelligence and diplomatic support of the United States. You know, it's as if the Iranians are not entitled to feel frightened. They don't have to be scared of us, and they don't have to be scared of Israel. When George W. Bush named Iran one of the three axis of evil, along with Iraq and North Korea, and then proceeded to destroy Iraq, funny, the Iranians thought they were next. Well, they shouldn't have felt that way, says our politicians. It isn't as if the Iranian people are not suffering in terms of their health care from economic boycotts, which are underway now, sanctions, which by impacting disproportionately civilian health and safety, violate international law. And we have evidence that Iranians are not being treated with adequate health care, diagnostic equipment, catheters because of this boycott. And it isn't if Iran hasn't proposed a serious plan to George W. Bush over 10 years ago to settle disputes and establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, which Mr. Bush completely ignored. The Iranians did not make it public because they have their hardliners, and they just sent it to the White House and the State Department under diplomatic privacy. And finally, here's the irony, David and Steve. It's Iranian soldiers now that are relieving us of the burden in Iraq and fighting ISIS and losing hundreds of their soldiers. Of course, they have a purpose there. They want to dominate Iraq. But what would happen if they weren't beating back ISIS and the air attacks from the U.S. is not turning the tide sufficiently? the demand would be to send some GIs more over there to kill and die. You want to get the whole column. It's on nader.org, and you can sign up free and get my weekly column automatically. But don't you find it really amazing when you look at the Sunday talk shows, when you look at the network news, and it's not just Fox News, that there's never anybody on who gives the other side of how the Iranians are looking at us. And while we don't like their belligerent words, they have suffered belligerent slaughter and deeds.
Ralph, can you reconcile your two positions on fast-tracking the Pacific trade deal and Netanyahu speaking and Senator Cotton's letter to Iran? On one hand, you've, on this show, said that you're opposed to fast-tracking the Pacific trade deal because we're not examining it through our legislative branch, and I believe the WTO is the ruling body with the Pacific Trade Agreement, leaving America out of it, and you're opposed to the fast-tracking the Pacific Trade Agreement. The negotiations with Iran that President Obama is conducting, this would be a binding agreement under, I guess, the aegis of the UN, leaving the legislative branch out. Wouldn't our founding fathers support a proactive Speaker of the House inviting a foreign dignitary to speak before Congress and a senator writing a letter to Iran? Isn't that good for the country? Isn't this what you would advocate?
Well, you make a very important point. When the U.S. government developed the status of forces agreement with the new Iraqi government a few years ago, the Iraqi constitution required the Iraqi parliament to ratify it. But Bush and Obama didn't believe that they had to send that to the Congress under our constitution to ratify it, even though it rose to the level of a foreign treaty with another foreign state. So now we come with this very, very ticklish situation where everybody knows that whatever Obama sends to the Congress, now under belligerent Republican control, anything he sends in terms of a deal with Iran on controlling nuclear weapons development is going to be turned down. And so here's my answer. One, I think all trade agreements should be considered treaties, and it should require 2/3 ratification instead of basically being rammed through under fast-track procedure, limited debate, no amendments, up or down, 51% wins. So you're asking, well, what about this Iran agreement? And here's where I stand on this. If the status of the agreement is below that of a treaty, and it's going to be interesting to see how Obama maneuvers this because he's negotiating it on behalf of the United States, and along with him are the heads of China, Russia, Germany, France, and England. And so if they try to downgrade it to a level below the treaty, they're going to have to engage in some footloose verbalization. If it's going to be an enforceable treaty by sanctions with the UN on board, it's hard to argue that he can get it done without having congressional approval. However, and this is a big however, my definition of a congressional approval is 2/3. And McConnell and Boehner's definition is going to be 51%, or to get it through the Senate, 60 votes. So here we are. Now, what's going to really happen? I think Obama will ignore the Congress, say he had the authority under the presidential role in conducting foreign affairs, and he can get it done by, in effect, signing off as the chief executive and commander-in-chief of the U.S. government.
Is that how it works if you're the president? If you join other countries in a treaty or a war, you don't need Congress, right?
That's the way it's been working because, A, you have more concentration of power for unilateral action in the White House and the presidency in recent decades, and Congress has been very happy to abandon its responsibility for these hard issues and relinquish their oath of office to exercise their oversight under the Constitution, like declaring war and ratifying treaties. and give it to the White House. And this has gone on under both parties. And it's tremendously undermining the balance of power and the separation of powers that our founding fathers cautiously and deliberately arranged for, because they did not want a runaway monarch called the president to plunge our country into war without having Congress deliberate it and either reject it or declare war.
So this is a real balance here we're talking about, because we've been on the show complaining about how Congress has not been active with war powers. And yet David's point is, in this case, everybody's now screaming and yelling at these 47 Republicans for this so-called breach of protocol, where Congress is getting involved, although it's in a warmongering role.
Yes, and the problem is twofold. It's whether he sends it to Congress and basically says, I'm not going to impeach me if you dare, because that's the only sanction on the presidency by the Congress. Or if Boehner and McConnell think that they can basically reject it with a 51% vote, it gets very tricky. Instead of a 2/3 vote, which Obama would win, so on a default position, they would basically say, it's yours, President Obama, to go ahead with. Nobody can sue. Nobody has standing to sue under the Supreme Court definition of standing. 300 million Americans, none of them can sue to challenge this. So it's up to the political interaction between the Congress and the White House, and you know who's going to win that. And as long as Barack Obama's in the presidency, he's going to be able to cut a deal with Iran. And I hope it's an effective deal that will restrain the U.S. military from getting sucked into another war, which I'm sure the Israeli present government would dearly love us to pursue.
But Ralph, ultimately, do you think what those 47 senators did was a good thing or a bad thing?
It was a bad thing because it was the interference during the process of negotiation. I mean, you don't want to have 47 senators say to the hardliners in Iran who do not want a deal, and they are challenging the prime minister of Iran, who apparently does want a deal. Basically, 47 senators are saying to the hardliners, you can go for it because we are going to overcome it and turn it down. And that was very bad. To do that while the tender, delicate negotiations are underway in Europe, to interfere that way. So I would be opposed to what those 47 senators did. And by the way, the leading senator was Senator Cotton, a former Iraq veteran, who just got elected as a freshman senator from Arkansas, and who was given, through a pro-Israeli PAC run by Bill Kristol, $1 million before the election.
Follow the money. Well, let's switch gears here as we head down the home stretch to a domestic issue. Ralph, we're hearing that the economy is improving. Job numbers every month seem to be going up. The stock market has completely recovered from the crash of 2008. But you wanted to talk about a report out of Ohio about some people who have apparently fallen through the cracks. Tell us about that.
A lot of people. Over 50 million Americans are on food stamps, number one. Number two, child poverty is up over the last 20 years. Number three, we have millions of people who've dropped out of the job market because they can't get a job. And if they don't keep pursuing it and they drop out for 6 months, they're not counted as unemployed. And number four, the soup kitchens can't keep up with the demand. They can't get enough contributed food from the charity impulses of the American people, which are quite substantial. And the lines are getting longer and longer outside the soup kitchens. So this article, which caught my attention, on Cleveland's west side, where there are a lot of poor people, there is a plucky church, the article says, where they're trying to keep up, but they can't. And so they're running out of food. The lines keep getting longer. And the governor, John Kasich, Republican, keeps saying the robust charitable impulse of America can handle needy problems of the poor. We don't need big government. And so on one of these lines, and it's really heartrending, the article says, quote, people were starting to get physical when they thought they'd been shortchanged or someone muscled in and got more than their share. Adults were discouraged from bringing children to the pantry. The city pushed the church to hire an off-duty police officer for security because too many people were arriving to get a prime spot in line and blocking the streets with their vehicles. While these hungry people waited in line, the economic outlet in Ohio was called, quote, brightening, end quote, according to Governor John Kasich. Well, this is what happens when you spend trillions of dollars blowing up countries overseas who never threatened us, and you don't put job creation programs back home to rebuild the roads, the bridges, the schools, the sewage, drinking water systems, the courtrooms, all the mass transit needs to be upgraded and modernized. And so the question basically we have to ask is, can't we make this a prime issue in the coming election? Really put the wood to all these politicians running local, state, national, to wake up and remember that they are supposed to represent the sovereignty of the people, and that the millions and millions of poor people who don't have jobs in this country, unless they go overseas by joining the Army, Air Force, and Navy to kill and die in unconstitutional wars and invasions and incursions abroad. I think people need to be more incensed. They got the facts on their side. Nothing can stop an aroused American people equipped with the facts in one hand and moral indignation on the other, on their way to the polls.
But Ralph, they'll just say, look, the economy is improving. Look at all of these numbers. That's the message that they put out there.
Yeah, but who's it improving for? 95% of the gains from the resurgent economy since the Wall Street collapse in 2008, 2009 have been swept up by a little over 1% of the people. That's who's gaining. The gap between the super rich and the rich is expanding. The gap between the rich and the rest is expanding. This is a banana republic, except for its weapon systems and its science and technology.
I've heard the gap is even worse than the banana republics of the 70s.
It may well be. American history has never seen a bigger divide between the tiny few and the rest. I mean, you've got the head of Walmart making $11,000 an hour. Let that sink in. Before noon on January 2, first day of work, he makes more than any one of 1 million workers make an entire year. Before noon. And did he earn it? Of course not. He appointed, and his predecessors, the members of the board of directors who they wine and dine, and then they put their compensation packages on the table. And in between their caviar and their expensive wines, the board of directors rubber stamped these huge compensation packages. And it's not just what they earn an hour. It's the private planes. It's the benefits. It's the perks. It's the gargantuan pensions. It's the consulting firms free to advise them on taxes. The shareholders are powerless because they ask to be. Remarkable definition of capitalism where the owners of the companies are powerless to control their hired hands at the top. And I criticize the giant mutual funds like Fidelity and Vanguard and the pension funds like the California Teachers Fund for not doing anywhere near enough to reassert the power of their constituency over the companies that they own. I mean, just think, worker pension funds own almost 32% of all the stock on the New York Stock Exchange. So why aren't they working that power? Because their representatives are entrenched in terms of the pension trustees. They're not really accountable to the workers back home who don't even know what's going on. How do you react to that?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
The system is rigged, and the thing that proved to me how rigged the system is, the Dow Jones Industrial is taking AT&T out and replacing it with Apple. And they always say the stock market goes up over time. And I'm thinking, of course it's going to go up over time if the Dow Jones Industrials get rid of the the stocks that are failing and replace them with the ones that are succeeding. Just the whole idea of the Dow Jones Industrial Average is evidence that the system is rigged. Where AT&T isn't doing well, let's put Apple in. Oh, now it's doing well.
Nice point, David. The Dow Jones Index that is often given as one yardstick for economic progress in the U.S. is itself rigged.
Nobody talks about that.
That's why we have you on the program, David.
Well, we've actually run out of time on David's salient point there. How
Ralph,
many times have we ended on David's salient
Ralph,
point?
don't be intimidated by me. It's just,
You make a very good point. What I like about you, David, is you actually read before the program, and you make some very good points.
Don't be intimidated by me, Ralph.
Yeah.
I treat everybody equally.
By the way, can't we ask just one question? Do we have time for one question, Steve?
Okay, we have just enough time to take one of your listener questions. This is from Albert Morris, and he asks, what can substitute for organized labor as a consensus-making force within a progressive party?
Right now, nothing. That's how barren and large the vacuum is of any organized progressive force in America. So I would suggest that people start in every congressional district an organized progressive force of regular citizens who agree on a common agenda that they can put to the Democratic Party.
Thank you for your question, Albert Morris. We have come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We had a great show with Mark Green. We talked about Netanyahu and Ohio hunger. Join us again next week for the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan. On behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, join us again next week.
And thank you, Steve and David, and your listeners.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person. And who will hear your voice?